The story begins in the world of monsters, a hidden realm where scare energy powers everything, from homes to cities, and the most respected profession is that of a scarer. A monster who ventures into the human world to collect the screams of terrified children. This is the story of two very different monsters, Mike Wazowski and James P. Sullivan, known to his friends as Sulley, and their unlikely journey to becoming the greatest scarers in monster history. Long before they became the legendary scarer team they are known as today. Mike and Sulley were just two kids with big dreams. Mike was a small, green, one-eyed monster with an unshakable belief that he was destined to be a scarer. He was born with a passion for scaring that burned brighter than any flame. From the time he was a tiny monster, Mike studied everything he could about scaring. He memorized scaring techniques, studied the anatomy of human children, and practiced his roar in front of the mirror for hours on end. He believed that with enough hard work, dedication, and knowledge, he could overcome any obstacle and achieve his dream. On a school field trip to the Monsters Incorporated scare floor, Mike got his first real glimpse of his future. He watched in awe as scarers moved through the doors into the human world, returning with scream canisters filled with powerful energy. He was mesmerized by the process, the skill, and the sheer power of it all. He was so captivated that he accidentally wandered past the safety line and found himself face to face with a real scarer. The scarer, impressed by the little monster's courage, told him that he had what it took to be a scarer. That moment changed Mike's life forever. Mike's dream was shared by another young monster, James P. Sullivan, the son of a famous scarer. Sulley was born into a legacy of greatness. His father, Bill Sullivan, was a legendary scarer, and everyone expected James to follow in his footsteps. Sulley had the natural talent, the size, and the intimidating presence of a scarer, but he lacked the drive and determination of his smaller rival. He coasted through life, relying on his family name and his natural gifts, never really putting in the effort to be truly great. When Mike and Sulley arrived at Monsters University, they were both determined to join the prestigious scaring program. Mike was excited to finally be among others who shared his passion, while Sulley was simply fulfilling his family's expectations. Their first encounter was at a fraternity party, where Sulley, with his natural charisma and size, quickly became the center of attention. Mike, on the other hand, was dismissed and mocked by the cool kids, including Sulley himself. Mike warned Sulley that he would prove himself, that he would scare circles around him. Sulley laughed it off, confident that his natural abilities would always make him superior. The two monsters became fierce rivals in Professor Knight's Scaring 101 class. Mike was the top student, acing every written test and mastering every theory, while Sulley relied on his natural talent and coasted through the practical exercises. Mike was frustrated by Sulley's laziness, and Sulley was annoyed by Mike's constant study and perfectionism. Their rivalry escalated when Dean Hardscrabble, a legendary scarer who held the all-time scare record, visited the class. She was unimpressed by Sulley's natural talent and dismissed Mike's book smarts. She believed that a scarer needed something more than knowledge or natural ability. She needed to see raw, instinctual fear. She was looking for monsters who were born scary, not monsters who had to work at it. At the end of the semester, Hardscrabble administered the final exam. Mike was eager to prove himself, but he was nervous and overthought his scares. His performance in the simulator was lackluster, and Hardscrabble told him that he lacked the scariness factor. She kicked him out of the scaring program. Sulley, who had failed his exam due to his carelessness, was also kicked out. Both monsters were devastated. Their dreams of becoming scarers were shattered. Determined to prove Hardscrabble wrong, Mike made a bet with her. He challenged her that he could win the Scare Games, a dangerous and competitive event where fraternities competed to prove their scaring skills. If Mike's team won, Hardscrabble would let him and his entire team into the scaring program. If he lost, he would leave Monsters University forever. Hardscrabble accepted the bet, confident that Mike would fail. Mike needed to form a fraternity to compete in the games. He was desperate and approached the Oozma Kappa fraternity, a group of misfits who were considered the weakest and most pathetic fraternity on campus. The Oozma Kappa brothers were a motley crew. Don, a middle-aged monster who had been downsized from his job, Terry and Terry, two-headed twins who couldn't agree on anything. Art, a New Age philosophy major who was more interested in feelings than fear, and Scott, Squishy, Squibbles, a shy, nerdy monster who lived with his mom. They were all rejects who had been kicked out of the scaring program. But they still dreamed of being scarers. Mike was initially embarrassed to be associated with Oozma Kappa, but he needed a team. He reluctantly joined them and took on the role of coach and captain. He was determined to whip them into shape and win the games, mostly to prove himself to Hardscrabble and Sulley. Sulley, meanwhile, was recruited by the top fraternity on campus, Rho Omega Rho, the elite fraternity for the best and brightest scaring students. Sulley was initially thrilled to be accepted by the cool kids, but he soon realized that they were arrogant and shallow. He was just another trophy for them, a famous name to add to their collection. He missed the camaraderie and the genuine sense of purpose he had felt while working with Mike's team. Under Mike's strict coaching, the Oozma Kappa brothers began to improve. They practiced scaring techniques, studied human psychology, and learned to work as a team. Mike was a harsh taskmaster, pushing them to their limits and constantly criticizing their efforts. Sulley, who had been struggling to fit in with the RORs, started to visit Mike and the Oozma Kappa brothers. He was impressed by their dedication and their genuine friendship. He started to help them train, offering advice and support. Mike and Sulley's relationship began to change. They started to see each other as rivals, but also as friends. They had both been humbled by their failures and had learned to appreciate each other's strengths. Mike admired Sulley's natural talent and charisma, while Sulley admired Mike's intelligence and determination. They realized that they were not so different after all. They both wanted to be great scarers, but they had different paths to get there. As the Scare Games progressed, Oozma Kappa faced increasingly difficult challenges. They had to navigate toxic environments, avoid librarians, and perform scares in front of the entire school. But they persevered, thanks to Mike's coaching and their growing friendship. They discovered their unique strengths: Don's experience, the twins' coordination, Art's creativity, and Squishy's surprising courage. They learned to trust each other and to believe in themselves. The final event of the Scare Games was a scare simulation. Each team had to perform a scare in front of a panel of judges, including Dean Hardscrabble. The Oozma Kappa brothers were determined to win. Mike went last, delivering what he believed was a perfect scare. But when the simulation ended, Hardscrabble announced that the Oozma Kappa had been disqualified. The simulator had been tampered with. Mike had cheated. Mike was devastated. He admitted to cheating, and he confessed that he had tampered with the simulator because he was afraid that his team would fail. He was banished from the university. Sulley was horrified. He realized that Mike had cheated because he was desperate to prove himself. He had pushed Mike too hard, and Mike had broken. Sulley tried to stop Mike from leaving, but Mike was too ashamed to stay. He had failed, and he had let his team down. Sulley, however, was determined to make things right. He followed Mike into the human world, where he found him lost and alone in a summer camp. Sulley found Mike in the woods, surrounded by human children. The children were terrified of Mike. But Mike was terrified of them. He was trying to escape, but he was trapped. Sulley helped Mike escape, and together they created a massive scare, generating enough scream energy to power the door and return home. The scare was so powerful that it restored Hardscrabble's faith in them. When they returned to Monsters University, Hardscrabble was waiting for them. She was impressed by their courage, their teamwork, and their ability to generate so much scream energy. She realized that they were both special in their own ways. She decided to let Mike and Sulley back into the university, but not into the scaring program. They were both too unconventional for her program. Instead, she suggested that they find another way to use their skills. She told them that there was more than one path to becoming a scarer, and that sometimes the best scarers come from the most unexpected places. Mike and Sulley were disappointed that they weren't being readmitted to the scaring program. But they were also relieved that they weren't being expelled. They had a second chance, and they were determined to make the most of it. They decided to take Hardscrabble's advice and find another way to pursue their dreams. They knew that they couldn't give up on their goal of becoming scarers, even if the path was not what they had expected. Sulley suggested that they start at the bottom and work their way up. He had heard that Monsters Incorporated, the largest scare company in the monster world, was always looking for new employees. They might not be able to start as scarers, but they could start in the mailroom or in some other entry-level position. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a foot in the door. Mike was hesitant at first, but he knew that Sulley was right. They had to start somewhere. Mike and Sulley packed their bags and said goodbye to their friends at Oozma Kappa. The brothers were sad to see them go, but they understood that Mike and Sulley had to follow their dreams. Don gave them a firm handshake and wished them well. Terry and Terry gave them a group hug, even though they couldn't agree on which side to hug from. Art presented them with dream journals to help them remember their goals. Squishy gave them a tearful goodbye, promising to visit them at Monsters Incorporated. The Oozma Kappa brothers were no longer just a fraternity. They were a family, and Mike and Sulley would always be a part of that family. Mike and Sulley traveled to Monsters Incorporated, a massive, imposing building that towered over the city. It was the heart of the monster world's scream energy industry, and it was where the most respected scarers in the world worked. Mike was nervous and excited, while Sulley was confident and determined. They walked through the massive doors and into the lobby, where they were greeted by a receptionist who looked bored and unimpressed. They told her that they were looking for jobs, and she pointed them toward the Human Resources Department. At Human Resources, Mike and Sulley were given a series of tests and interviews. They were asked about their qualifications, their experience, and their goals. Mike talked about his knowledge of scaring theory, his passion for the field, and his determination to become a scarer. Sulley talked about his family legacy, his natural talent, and his desire to live up to his father's name. The HR representative, a large, imposing monster with a monotone voice, was unimpressed. She told them that they didn't have the qualifications to become scarers. They weren't scary enough, and they didn't have the experience. She offered them jobs in the mailroom. Mike was disappointed, but he knew that it was a start. He accepted the job, and Sulley followed suit. They were given their ID badges and sent to the mailroom, a vast, cavernous space filled with conveyor belts, sorting machines, and piles of packages. They were assigned to work under a grumpy old monster named Merv, who had been working in the mailroom for decades. Merv was skeptical of the two new employees, but he agreed to show them the ropes. The mailroom was a far cry from the scare floor. There were no screams, no children, and no excitement. Just endless piles of mail and packages. Mike and Sulley were tasked with sorting the mail, delivering packages to various departments, and occasionally dealing with angry employees who complained about their mail not being delivered on time. It was tedious, repetitive, and thankless work. But Mike and Sulley refused to give up. Mike used his free time to study the company's operations. He learned everything he could about how Monsters Incorporated worked, from the logistics of the mailroom to the intricacies of the scare floor. He memorized the company's policies and procedures, and he studied the scare records of the top scarers. He wanted to be ready for any opportunity that came his way. Sulley, on the other hand, used his charm and charisma to make friends in the mailroom and in other departments. He got to know the janitors, the security guards, and the cafeteria workers. He even managed to befriend one of the junior scarers, who gave him tips on how to succeed in the scare program. Sulley knew that networking was just as important as hard work, and he was determined to build relationships that would help him and Mike advance. Months passed, and Mike and Sulley's hard work began to pay off. They were no longer just mailroom workers. They were known as the two most dedicated and hardworking employees in the company. Their managers noticed their efforts, and they began to receive more responsibilities. They were given the opportunity to work on special projects, to help out in other departments, and to interact with more senior employees. One day, a special opportunity arose. Monsters Incorporated was hosting a scare tryout, an event where aspiring scarers could demonstrate their skills and audition for a spot in the company's scare program. The competition was fierce, and only the best would be chosen. Mike and Sulley were initially hesitant to apply. They knew that they didn't have the experience or the qualifications of the other candidates. But they also knew that this might be their only chance to prove themselves. Mike and Sulley decided to apply. They spent weeks preparing for the tryout. Mike reviewed all of his scaring theories, practiced his roars, and developed a comprehensive strategy. Sulley practiced his scares, worked on his timing, and developed a new routine. They also spent hours practicing together, combining their skills and developing a seamless partnership. The day of the tryout arrived, and Mike and Sulley were nervous. They watched as other candidates, many of whom were graduates of the top scaring programs, performed their scares. They saw monsters with massive claws, terrifying teeth, and intimidating roars. They felt out of place. But they refused to give up. When it was their turn, Mike and Sulley walked onto the stage together. The judges, including several senior executives and a representative from the scare board, looked skeptical. They were an odd pair, a small, green, one-eyed monster and a large, blue, furry monster. They didn't look like scarers, but they were determined to prove everyone wrong. Mike and Sulley performed a coordinated scare, combining Mike's knowledge and strategy with Sulley's natural talent and presence. They used misdirection, teamwork, and creativity to create a scare that was greater than the sum of its parts. The judges were impressed. They had never seen a scare like it before. They had always thought that scarers had to work alone, that they had to be solitary and independent. But Mike and Sulley showed them that teamwork could be just as effective, if not more so. The judges deliberated for what felt like hours. Mike and Sulley waited nervously, their hearts pounding in their chests. Finally, the head judge stood up and made the announcement. "Congratulations," he said. "You're both hired. Welcome to the scare program." Mike and Sulley were overjoyed. They had done it. They had proven everyone wrong. They were going to be scarers. They embraced each other, tears of joy streaming down their faces. Their journey had been long and difficult, but they had finally achieved their dream. The news of their acceptance spread quickly through the company. Their friends at Oozma Kappa were thrilled, and they sent them a congratulations card signed by all the brothers. Even Hardscrabble sent them a letter, congratulating them on their success and reminding them that she had always known they had potential, even if they didn't fit the traditional mold. Mike and Sulley began their training as scarers. They learned everything they needed to know about the scare floor, the doors, and the human world. They practiced their scares, perfected their techniques, and developed their own unique style. They were taught by some of the best scarers in the world, including some of the legends they had admired for so long. The training was grueling. Mike and Sulley had to work harder than they ever had before. They had to overcome their insecurities and fears, and they had to learn to trust each other completely. But they refused to give up. They knew that they had been given a second chance, and they were determined to make the most of it. After months of training, Mike and Sulley were finally ready for their first real scare. They were assigned a simple scare, a 6-year-old boy who was afraid of the dark. It wasn't the most challenging assignment, but it was their first, and they were determined to succeed. Mike and Sulley entered the door and found themselves in a small, dark bedroom. The boy was asleep in his bed, his nightlight casting a soft glow on the room. Mike and Sulley crept forward, their hearts pounding. They knew that they had to be careful. One wrong move, and the boy could wake up and call for his parents. Mike and Sulley worked together seamlessly. They used their combined skills to create a terrifying scare. Sulley's massive form loomed over the bed, while Mike's clever misdirection distracted the boy's attention. The boy woke up, saw the two monsters, and screamed. It was a perfect scream, a high-pitch head, terrified wail that filled the room with powerful scream energy. Mike and Sulley collected the scream in their canister and exited the door, triumphant. They had done it. They had completed their first scare. Over the next few years, Mike and Sulley became one of the most successful teams in the history of Monsters Incorporated. They broke records, won awards, and earned the respect of their peers. They had proven that they were not just two monsters who had gotten lucky. They were two of the most talented scarers in the world. Mike and Sulley's success was due to their unique partnership. They complemented each other perfectly. Mike was the strategist, the planner, the one who always had a plan B. Sulley was the performer, the one who could sell any scare and win any audience. Together, they were unstoppable. Their friendship also deepened. They had been through so much together, and they knew each other better than anyone. They had faced failure, rejection, and disappointment. They had also experienced success, triumph, and joy. They were no longer just rivals or co-workers. They were brothers. The story of Mike and Sulley became legendary. They were an inspiration to monsters everywhere, showing that with hard work, determination, and a little bit of luck, anyone could achieve their dreams. They proved that even the smallest, greenest monster could become the greatest scarer in the world. One day, as Mike and Sulley were walking through the halls of Monsters Incorporated, they passed by the Scare Records board. Their names were at the top, just below the all-time record held by none other than Dean Hardscrabble. Mike looked at the board and smiled. "You know," he said, "we're pretty good at this." Sulley laughed. "Yeah," he said, "we're the best." Mike and Sulley continued to work at Monsters Incorporated for many years. They trained new scarers, mentored young monsters, and continued to break records. Their partnership became the stuff of legend, and their story was passed down from generation to generation. They became the scarers that everyone wanted to be, the role models that every monster looked up to. And when they finally retired, they looked back on their journey with pride. They had overcome every obstacle, faced every challenge, and achieved every dream. They were no longer just Mike and Sulley. They were legends.